Hi everybody, good morning and welcome to this webinar about consumer or customer understanding. I'm Dr Richard Whittle. I'm an economist with a background in looking at behavioural economics, behavioural science, and today I'm going to talk to you about why understanding is on the agenda, why it's important, how we can understand to help understanding and what understanding actually is, and then some tools, or some quick tools which might help your customers with their understanding and decision making. So if there are any questions, just pop them in the chat. Everything will get collated and we'll get back to you after the session. So I'm a behavioural economist. That means that I really try to understand how people make decisions, barriers to decision making, and really how to help people have a good consumer or customer journey with whatever product it might be. My particular research is in something called dark patterns, which are bits of website design, online design, and kind of design and process, which affects negatively consumers' decision making. I research artificial intelligence and decision making, and I look at something called digital behavioural insights. They are, again, tools, tips, insights into how people make decisions online. So some of my previous work, I led the technical team for the retail economy for the Greater Manchester Independent Prosperity Review. I've done lots of work around different demographics and decision making. My 2017 work on financial rules of thumb helped inform the Financial Advice Working Group report for the Treasury and FCA. I develop artificial intelligence informed models for looking at different aspects of the economy. I look at different types of technology and how that affects our decision making, in particular our spending technologies, whether it's contactless payments, paying on our phone, that kind of thing. Really looking there how friction or lack of friction in a decision making process affects how people spend their money. In fact, in the literature, we call it spending without thinking, where payments are made so easy, so straightforward, people don't necessarily fully consider the decision they're making. All this kind of wrapped up into a recent book where I looked at new technologies and again how they may affect decision making, work, that kind of thing. So today I thought it'd be useful to talk about why we're concerned about understanding and some of the developments really over the last few years, particularly since COVID, around how people are making decisions, how they're making financial decisions, and how they are reacting to the wider context or the wider decision-making context. In the literature, we kind of call this choice environment, choice architecture, but really how people are reacting to these wider economic, wider societal circumstances in their decision making. In particular, I'm going to talk today about something called the board market hypothesis, which is exactly what it says on the tin. This is where, in COVID in particular, a large number of people had very, very little to do. And one of the things that we saw was a uptick in new types of trading, new types of investment processes, new types of investment products, like cryptocurrencies, those type of thing, and people making decisions quickly, intuitively, generally because they were bored online. In fact, there was a really good report from Bloomberg which suggested in lockdown around 20% of all online investments were to do with people simply being bored and having very little to do. One of the things which is really relevant at the moment, and again something I'm sure you've seen all the ads around, particularly ads from the regulator warning people about this, is the gamification of financial decision making. People making financial decisions based on having fun, and with that the associated market around financial decisions, smartphone applications that maybe allow you to follow different types of traders, maybe allow you to collect, say, meaningless points or stars along with financial decisions. And in essence, the gamification of financial decision making, certainly from the regulator point of view, is really emphasizing a fun aspect of financial decision making, of investment, of trading, and potentially that's affecting how people are really thinking about the decisions they're making. Over the last decade or so, but very, very recently as well, as I'm sure you've seen in the press, something called dark patterns are really coming to the fore. Dark patterns, sludge and friction is something that is really affecting or potentially affecting how people make decisions. We'll come on to all of these later in the presentation, but simply dark patterns are online tricks and manipulations which can affect your decision making. If you've ever wondered why you signed up for a free subscription and then you're paying for it a year later, it's probably something to do with the dark pattern. Likewise, if you've ever tried to leave a social media site, or if you leave a gym, for instance, and again found it very, very difficult, it's probably something to do with a dark pattern. It's probably something to do with the design of that process, making it very easy to sign up for and very difficult to leave. Again, over the last decade or so, our understanding of how people make decisions around behavioural biases and around heuristics, around the shortcuts in decision making, has really increased. And so what we're starting to see is that we can anticipate, or we can better understand how people are making these types of decisions. We have a better knowledge base from which to support customers. And again, it's really relevant. That's increased so much over the last decade or so. And why are we concerned about understanding? We're concerned about understanding because we understand it so much better than we ever have done. And we have better tools with which to help people. So quickly, I'll talk about the board market hypothesis. This is that theory that the increase in different types of trading in the pandemic, in the lockdown, were the result of reduced social activity, were the result of increased boredom. Potentially, as some people argue, and really also ignited by, say, stimulus checks, bits of extra money that people didn't know what to do with, and all this media activity. One of the things that, again, we saw is this increased free time, this really easy access to trading platforms, desires to new types of entertainment, different types of social interaction. And it's the social interaction I'll come on to a second, because often the board market hypothesis, or this type of trading, is accompanied by online investment communities. And of course, one which we're probably all familiar with is Wall Street Bets and the GameStop short squeeze. Many papers, many researchers advocate or argue that online investment communities supported by easy access to different types of trading really make the ability for this community to kind of potentially affect the market, but actually this community feeds on each other, it grows, and people are making investments not based on amounts of data or solid research, but potentially making decisions based around social media, around memes, around these online communities. So I was going to show you briefly a piece of research in a second. Firstly, talk a little bit about gamification of financial decision making as well, because these two things, board markets and gamification, kind of go hand in hand. Gamification is using what we're calling here game design elements to make investment in a different type of fun, a different type of activity, and potentially by including things like reward systems, stars, points, different types of competition around the biggest trade, the best trade, most frequent trades, those kind of things, really changing how people are making their financial decisions from something that is considered, thought out, based potentially on expert advice, to something that is much more reactive, something that's far quicker, something that's more akin to a computer game than investment and trading as we previously understood it. And again, some of the things we can unpick there, talking potentially about expert advice, whereas previously that may have been for these communities financial advisors, authority figures, significant amounts of research from recommended financial press or traditional financial press. Actually, the experts in this case tend to be, or can be, those social media communities, those online communities. So whilst gamification can encourage positive financial behaviours, increasing kind of uptake of different types of financial product, different understandings of the product itself, actually what we can see is that it can lead to impulsive decision making and risk taking if not properly managed. We need to understand how this gamification and the wider social context come together to impact understanding of the products, understanding of that decision-making process. So this is a piece of work, a piece of research that I'm currently doing with Stuart Mills and Gavin Brown, and we are investigating one of these online communities, and what we're doing is in essence matching sentiment to return on investment. This is quite a significant process, as there are millions of people involved with these communities. Sentiment itself is difficult. These communities have very, very bespoke and particular types of language for how they're feeling about different trades, but fundamentally we're matching the level of satisfaction, the level of happiness against the return on investment. And we used an artificial intelligence program to help us, simply because it was so vast, but also because that language being used within the online community was so different to different types of languages which we tend to use for traditional sentiment analysis. Again, just a quick lesson there. When people are talking about sentiment analysis, what that relies on are different types of dictionaries. Dictionaries, in essence, where people give different words, different scores. We put that together and we get a score for sort of sentiment of, say, somebody's post or somebody's communication. Those dictionaries themselves can be really vulnerable to the types of language used when people may be using words in a traditionally negative words in a positive sense, or vice versa. Again, the language around cryptocurrency, the language around gamified investment trading and online investment communities is particularly bespoke. In fact, if you ever get some of these posts and start to have a look at them, it can look like you are reading something indecipherable, which is why we had to use an AI tool. However, what was the upshot of this? The upshot of this is this graph. And this graph shows that people making potentially bored, gamified investments based on these online communities expected, they required a return of nearly 40% to be happy and comfortable with that return. If they got a return of less than 40% here, what they started to do was potentially change their investments, feel dissatisfied, again, make those quick, intuitive trades. They required to be comfortable with their investment, to see their investments as a success, a return of nearly 40% or higher. And if they didn't get that, then they changed their behaviors. What does this tell us? This tells us that when people are making these type of decisions, potentially, again, they're going on quick instinct, they're not necessarily taking in all the information. Potentially their tools and the communities they use are encouraging really rapid trades and quite unrealistic returns as well. So when we start to understand decision making in these contexts and support consumers making decisions in these contexts, it is around pausing, really considering the decision and considering the outcome as well. So, other things that can affect our decision making. Firstly, dark patterns. These are different types of design techniques which we see in websites and apps which really affect people's decision making. They may present a lot of different options, different choices. They may surreptitiously hide different or reduce the font of different types of salient information. There are famous dark patterns out there, say customer service charges really being hidden in small fonts in different kind of areas of websites. You've probably come across dark patterns if you are trying to cancel subscriptions. A very famous recent one is that subscriptions potentially can only be cancelled in a particular time frame, say maybe in the 3 or 4 days after being taken out, something along those lines. And of course, undoubtedly in today's and yesterday's press, you'll have seen that a large online retailer is being charged by the FTC for allegedly using dark patterns to manipulate consumers into signing up for their other services as well. Very related, something called Sludge, which in essence is making the user wade through a series of processes when they're trying to make a decision that business may not want them to. So again, think about trying to delete a social media account and think about how many times a user may have to click through statements such as their friends or family will miss them, such as all their information will be deleted, potentially how many times they'll be given options to deactivate their account for 30 days or something along those lines instead of permanently deleting it. Related to this is friction, and generally friction is considered to be anything that prevents a user from accomplishing their goals. It can be something which interrupts a decision process that makes it harder for somebody to make that decision. However, I frequently argue that at least a little bit of friction is often good. Why? Because friction can also create pause points or allow a user to consider a decision. So let's think about, I suppose, the opposite side of this. An online retailer may store your card details, may store your address details, may have a buy it now or a one-click buy function, those kind of things. They remove friction in your decision-making process. Actually introducing some friction, potentially having to collect and input your own card details, type out, fill in that form, could potentially allow somebody time to reevaluate that decision. We certainly see in the physical world, removing friction with, say, contactless payments, paying on your phone, that kind of thing, really potentially increases the amount of small purchases people make. Again, think about the contactless limits that we've had, the £5 to £30 to £100, and potentially if your behaviours has changed because of the reduction of friction there. All of these things can combine to create poor user experiences, a loss of trust, and a loss of consumer agency in that decision making process. Potentially can push consumers down a particular direction. That direction might be to quickly accept cookies and to accept all cookies, maybe to accept without thinking a terms and conditions document, those type of things. all of these behavioural techniques are something to be really aware of when we're talking about consumer understanding. So here is a dark patterns audit framework, which with colleagues we invented, and this looks around different types of dark patterns. For in-store, for instance, detours may be where somebody gets upsold at online at checkouts, where potentially actually a different version of the product, a premium version of the product might appear. Roundabouts, where there are a long series of are you sure checks, and again, different types of dark patterns, things which may affect consumer understanding. This is an old one, but personally one of my favorites. This is the cancellation process for a gym where you can sign up with, in essence, 2 clicks. And the way to cancel that 2-click sign up is to physically go into that gym, and actually if you go through with a physical letter as well. Signing up is really easy, leaving is very, very hard. This is a classic design process which actually makes it harder for somebody to do what they have decided to do. Our understanding of behavioural biases and heuristic behavioural phenomena which impact and affect decision making again has increased. We understand better than ever how people make decisions, how people use information to inform those decisions, because we have a better understanding of behavioural biases and heuristics. Behavioural biases are descriptions of decision-making processes which can potentially lead somebody or describe how somebody has made a suboptimal decision. Maybe they were overconfident. Maybe they simply reinforced what they already thought they knew. Maybe they already had a process and were simply looking to confirm it. Again, very easily done when we understand, say, how search engines work and how people make searches there. Coupled with this are heuristics. Heuristics are simply shortcuts that we use to make decisions or to enable decisions in a really data heavy or information heavy world. We simply cannot process the amount of information that is available to us. So we use a heuristic or a shortcut to make that decision. If we think about all the information available for something as simple as choosing a coffee in your local coffee shop, number of choices, number of sizes, number of syrups, number of milks, number of every other option you can have, actually you get to a huge potential possible option of different types of coffee you could choose to buy. Our rational decision-making model is something akin to you working out every one of those choices and you identifying or ranking which is your preferred choice. In reality, we use a heuristic to cut through this. We may simply have the same coffee that we order day in, day out. We may choose from 1, 2, or 3 different options depending on how we feel. We may listen to a recommendation from the barista or from a friend or from a colleague about what type of coffee they enjoy. But what we don't do is process all the information available to us to make that decision. That's just one decision that many people make every day. The decisions around their financial products, again, are huge amounts of information out there. Heuristics that people use there can be tend to be around expert heuristics, relying on expert advice, having trust in expert advice to make the right decision. But as that heuristic relies on expert advice and people providing the salient and relevant information, we just need to be aware of, again, how people make decisions at that point. So if we put all of this together, a broad market hypothesis or the wider context of decision making, the gamification of financial decision making, our understanding of dark patterns, sludge and friction, coupled with behavioural biases and heuristics, we can see why consumer understanding is really at the top of everyone's agenda. The last few years have presented a number of different challenges in understanding and supporting decision making. So moving on, we're going to talk a little bit now about actually how to understand, or how we understand how people actually understand their type of documentation. So the first thing we often hear about is cognitive overload or information overload. Quite simply, people are given too much information. As we heard about the heuristics, it's really difficult to make a fully informed decision. People can feel overwhelmed. They may make any decision just to have to stop making that decision. They can make decisions, again, relying on those heuristics around simply trusting the experts, or they can avoid making a decision altogether. They decide to, say, take out a financial product, they begin the research, they see how much is out there, and they pull back. They decide not to. Maybe they, for them, make a salient or seemingly salient alternative decision. I want to save for a pension, I can't decide what to do, therefore I'm going to open a new savings account instead and make that decision later. That kind of thing. When we talk about information overload, we talk about the need to simplify information, break it down into manageable chunks, use clear, concise and simple language. So a huge amount of excellent academic research is being done and has been done around information overload. Every individual has a limited capability of processing all this information. When information load exceeds that ability to process it, we get information overload. It can confuse an individual, affect their ability to set priorities, make prior information harder to recall, lead to poor decision making, create anxiety and stress. Again, it can change people's decision making process. It can stop them making decisions. It can make them drop out of a decision they were making, and it can potentially increase their perception of risk around whatever they're trying to do. There's so much information out there. I don't understand it. Am I making the right choice? Is this too risky a choice for me to make? All of these things can lead people to dropping out of that decision-making process. And again, we see this, or saw this traditionally in the UK in the pensions market, about people not necessarily making pension choices. So all of these things kind of, again, come together. Our behavioural biases, our systematic errors in decision making, our heuristics, our shortcuts of how we make decision making, the amount of information out there, again, all comes together to something that can affect understanding. So I propose a very simple understanding system which misses huge amounts of the complexity out there. This is something that I use to help me understand how people may make decisions in this context which we've described. And in this case, we see a system where understanding in the centre is affected by sludge, excess information, gamification. We can also see some changes that we can make to the system. So here I've called something guided reading, and guided reading is a shorthand for a structured, supported system of helping a customer understand and engage with their documentation. If we increase that in this understanding system, then we can increase understanding by reducing bias, by reducing impulsive choices, by supporting people with excess information so that information becomes actually accessible. So then, what I think would be useful to spend the last few minutes on is talking about how we check customer understanding and why a behavioural science approach really is useful in doing this. Firstly, behavioural science approach gives significant insights into how people make decisions, how they use that information, and any barriers to this as well. Behavioural science helps us understand that understanding is subjective. It is not, unfortunately, as simple as just asking people if they understand their product or understand their documentation. People very often think that their understanding is far better than it is, or they want the person who's asking them to think it is. Again, we need to get through this, and we get through this by testing rather than asking, by evaluating a customer's understanding, by getting them to demonstrate it rather than simply asking. So, by example, if I were to ask most people, this group, if they were an above average driver, the vast majority statistically would say yes. The vast majority would say they're significantly above average. That is not good enough. If we ask most of the UK, we will find that the answer is that a huge proportion of the UK consider themselves to be above average drivers. We know statistically that cannot be true, which is why we test driving rather than simply asking a 17-year-old if they think they're okay to drive. We have a test. This is the same thing. People's understanding can be affected by those behavioural biases. We can be overconfident in our understanding. We can think because we understood a different but maybe similar type of product at one time, we fully understand the decisions we're making now. We can understand, or we can think we understand because we support our perceived understanding with quick information searches. We can think we understand simply because we haven't had any information to the contrary. This is why we test rather than ask. And at the same time, behavioural biases lets us understand about all this sludge, all this bias, all this information overload, and lets us understand why people might not take in all the relevant information. Crucially, behavioural science allows us to devise strategies to help people understand. So, for AJ Bell, we did a project around checking the actual understanding of AJ Bell customers around their documentation. And I won't go into much detail of this project other than telling you really how we did it, because I think that's really relevant just to take in potentially for your own understanding about how people make decisions. Firstly, with this study, we fully audited the documentation consumers received. Why? This was to check that there were no barriers to understanding in the actual documentation themselves. Much of the research around how people make these decisions point to information overload, point to inaccessible, financially complex, jargon-filled documentation as a significant barrier to understanding. Most of the industry has done huge amounts of work on preventing that. So this audit, in essence, was to check that the documentation that customers receiving did not contain behavioural phenomena which would affect or negatively affect understanding. Documents were audited to ensure that the jargon was appropriate and accessible, that information overload wasn't present or wasn't an issue, that the design supported consumer understanding, and that there were limited examples or little examples of behavioural phenomena which may impact understanding. Once we'd ascertained that there wasn't an impediment to understanding in that documentation, we needed to move on to actually testing understanding. And we took a experimental survey approach to test understanding. We'll come to a little bit more detail on this later, but really what we did was use this approach to assess the natural level of understanding of consumers on their documentation, how people understood the material, the impact of some of the most common tools for increasing understanding, such as text simplification. We use these studies to understand if there's any relationship between risk profile, consumer profile and understanding, and we use this survey approach to check for issues around information overload. Finally, we did a qualitative deep dive as well, partially to check the reliability and validity of that survey and that experimental approach, to make sure everybody was on the same page, that we could compare answers, there was no misunderstanding, and also to deep dive into how people specifically made their decisions around their financial products or their financial decision making. So firstly, the document review, just a little bit more information on that. Coming back to that key report from earlier, information overload occurs when the nature of information is uncertain, complex, intense, ambiguous, and specifically it can occur when there are a number of different potentially similar choices or different attributes to the product as well. So the document review looked to ensure that each document was simple and clear, that jargon was minimized, that there was little or no ambiguity, that in essence there was nothing in the language which impacted understanding. It also checked that any visual aids and the design really did support understanding and decision making, that the information that the consumers were getting was really relevant to their decision making process, checked that the information that their consumers received online could be used by the consumer in a way that actually helped them to understand, that it was in manageable chunks, that they had control over the speed of which they received the information, known as progressive disclosure. We checked the documents for behavioural nudges, for framing, and building on the survey as well. Again, this kind of circular or a test, learn, and adapt process. We checked that there were feedback and clarification mechanisms built into the document. So prompts to speak to the financial advisor, prompts to a glossary or to more information, prompts to customer services, those kind of things. Then we did this experimental design. Said we tested rather than asked people if they understood. We tested if people understood. Because we took this approach, we're also able to see really what works. So the survey works as such. The customer base was allocated one of 4 different surveys. Each survey had the same questions to test understanding, but they have different types of prompts in there. So for instance, one of the surveys asking questions about web access had simplified language, whereas the control survey had the standard text from the terms and conditions document. We were then able to compare the actual understanding of the group that had the simplified text compared to the group that had the original text, those kind of things. So our experimental approach helps us to understand not only how people made the decision, the different types of understanding that they had, but which contexts supported or hindered those understandings as well. As part of the research, or one of the outcomes of this research project, was a real investigation into what is understanding in this type of context. How did we understand documentation, how can we understand the product, and what is understanding for an informed decision-making process. And there were a variety of different types of understanding. We identified customers who had a really good full understanding of their documentation. We identified a number of customers who had strategies to develop that understanding when they needed. And strategies to develop that understanding could be, I know where the documents are, before I make any decisions, I look up what I'm doing, or something potentially simple as my understanding is synonymous with my relationship with my advisor, and I work with my advisor when I'm making decisions to ensure that I am making a fully informed decision I am happy with. Fundamentally, the vast majority of customers had a good understanding when it was required. The decisions they were making are informed decisions based on a real solid understanding of information. And lastly, I think we'll just pull up the qualitative research and the qualitative customer journey about how people made decisions. And again, this is really important, again, for a number of reasons, but I will just pick out now a couple of these decision-making points where understanding can be supported, potentially by really simple prompts, simple bits of information, or simple bits of clarification. So one of the big aspects around consumer understanding, again, is that relationship with the advisor. A large proportion of customers in this study relied on that advisor to support their understanding when they needed it. What that meant, of course, is that when they didn't need it, they didn't necessarily engage with the documentation. They had something called a familiarity bias. They were already familiar, they already spoke through with the advisor. They didn't necessarily fully engage with the latest versions of the documentation. We also saw how the wider context can impact decision making. Even though we audited or fully audited all the documentation that the customer receives, and we were happy that it didn't contain information that would affect decision making, if we say consider performance information at the moment, what we can see, given our understanding of how people make decisions, the wider economic context can really impact that. So even though performance information is factual with few impediments to understanding, the context in which people may read that information, given the context of the UK, current context of the UK economy, may prompt rapid and quick decision making. Again, we suggest prompts at this stage of the decision making process as well. However, thank you so much for listening today. I'm Dr. Richard Whittle, and love for questions in the chat. Again, they'll all get collated and we'll get back to you after the recording. Thank you very much.